Video games are a very popular format that would see many iterations and adaptations of movie franchises that would also hit mainstream audiences, that would start way back primarily from the early adaptations of video games that would go on through various generations of consoles, but would start to come into its own stage of popularity with the rise of 32-bit consoles during the mid-90s, as there were many iconic movies that were appearing at that time. But in saying that, when we look back at the history of movie adaptations of video games, there's always been somewhat of a disconnect. Not all movie adaptations have always been considered to be good, or what would happen was the movies themselves would be terrible but the games would be half decent, but more often than not the movies would be brilliant but the games would be very mediocre at best. And unfortunately this next game that we're going to look at in this video falls under that category also, which would be Men in Black, which most of you probably know about this game anyway. And when we look over the history of the movie franchise, like the first Men in Black movie was a very popular movie in its own right when it was released during the mid-90s. So inevitably a game was going to be adapted at some point. And that's usually always the case with big budget hitting franchises. And Men in Black the game was predominantly that iteration, but at the same time, while it did have the name of the franchise itself, it would be a very different concept compared to what was seen in the movie, which was originally released on the Windows PC in late 97 and then later ported then to the PlayStation in early 1998. But unlike the movie, that would primarily be more of a comedy that starred Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. The game itself would act as a survival horror game, which was completely different from what would have been seen in the cinema or the movie itself. So while the game flopped in all intents and purposes, in a lot of respects to it, even though it's not as good compared to when you try to compare it to the likes of Resident Evil, which again this game in its own right is inspired by the iconic earlier Resident Evil games but just uses the Men in Black movie franchise name. There are similarities but yet there are also differences, as it's not as well refined, and it's interesting to see the characteristics behind what the developers were thinking about. But again, it really dates back to the likes of the whole concept around early 32-bit games and consoles in general. It was a time when experimental nature was really high in games, that even when you look at even the likes of the iconic Jurassic Park series, which again had many movie adaptations that were ported to games, some being decent while others probably not so good, but the PlayStation was no exception to this when you had the likes of Jurassic Park: The Lost World, and among many others there was even like fighting games and so forth as well. So there was loads of different types of these style of games that were appearing on 32-bit consoles at the time. But when we look back, there's very few games really as such that really hit the heights of success. The only real game as such that really was considered popular in terms of a movie adaptation would have been Alien Trilogy, that would have been released back in 1996. That would have been more of a Doom clone that inspired the events of the original 3 movies, but was all tied into a video game from a first-person shooter perspective. But all intents and purposes, as it's more like a Doom clone, that game is phenomenal. That game got everything right. It probably is considered for its time the best movie adaptation of any type of movie IP ever seen in a video game. And it's also considered to be one of the best FPS shooters pretty much of all time, and it's definitely one of the best on the PlayStation, as it gets everything right. It captures all of the elements from the movies while also having a very dark, gritty and unnerving atmosphere that very few games were ever able to replicate back then. But unfortunately Men in Black isn't able to follow the same feat. But in saying that, while it's not as reflective of other iconic survival horror titles that would have been seen on the system, it does have some unique quirks to it. While it's not as well refined, it does have unique ambience and atmosphere to it that does suit what the game is going for. And it does have some unique level design, many ideas of which I actually have seen and covered even in a previous video I did not too long ago, where various developers and creators use many background variations and scenes from the Men in Black game to create a mod for a Resident Evil style game, which I'll link to that video in the description. So it's pretty much just a mod that takes elements from Resident Evil but uses the Men in Black kind of offset in terms of its levels, because while Men in Black the game itself wasn't considered great, it did have some really good backdrops and scenery in the game. That's one of its highlights, and it was very atmospheric. If anything, the best point that the game did have, aside from all of its controls and features. It definitely had a good ambience and a nerve and tone to the game. It definitely managed to capture that element of survival horror right in most regards. But in saying that, it does utilise the characters from the movie itself, but has a different kind of outlay in terms of its own story. It kind of acts as its own individual story as such in many ways, where you have to interact with different environmental hazards. You also have to look for clues. You have to dispatch enemies using the variety of different weapons and upgrades that you will acquire throughout the game. And while it's not considered a success, the game did sell in very decent numbers across the board, selling 100,000 units within its first couple of months in the United States alone. And by 1998 it managed to sell another 50,000 copies and then counting as of that point. But even with that, as we all know, because the game is considered to be one of the worst movie iterations seen on a video game, especially on the PlayStation, it was very reflective also in its reviews at the time as well. It didn't get good reviews at all, because the gameplay, while it does use fixed camera perspective styles with pre-rendered backgrounds and so forth, which for my own personal opinion I think is cool because I love those style of games, but there are better games on the system that definitely have better control systems, because the control system in Men in Black is very, very clunky and poor, especially when you consider it to the likes of Resident Evil and other types of clones similar to it. It's not as well put together, but you can see what the developers were trying to do. If you're a fan of these type of games in all respects to it, it's still worth a try, I think, just to at least witness what early ideas and games of that generation had to offer in most respects. But I will admit, it isn't for everybody and not everybody will like it. Only a select few gamers, pretty much like myself, would have the patience to sit down and play something like this, which doesn't often happen. And even for myself going back, I played a lot of these type of games growing up, and if I did get into a game, regardless of how bad or how good it was, I would always give it the benefit of the doubt, and I would always try to see the game for what it was. And while the PlayStation does have some phenomenal games, it also does have some very mediocre and poor games, but at the same time most of them are playable, and depending on how much time you put into them and depending on your patience level, you can get something out of them. And see, for me personally, from my own experience, I originally played this way back. A mate of mine had rented it out one weekend and he took it down to the house one evening, and I was interested to play it because, again, we were all mad into anything that was like Resident Evil, any game that pretty much used pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera angles, regardless of whether it was Resident Evil or not. We were interested because we were intrigued by these style of games, because again, they had all of the unique elements that we all liked, especially for myself. They had the ambience, they had the atmosphere, and especially with the fixed cameras, you couldn't really see what was there or what wasn't there until you come into the next scene. So there was always that air of curiosity around each of the elements in the game, which is what I always enjoyed about them. There was always that level of uncertainty that just always left you guessing. Plus, these games, even though this game here itself isn't considered to be good, but it was creepy, it definitely had many elements like that, and that's why I enjoyed them so much, and I would always try to give them a go. And I remember then a couple of years later I managed to get the game cheap in a local game store, and I got it for like about £8 or something like that. Like, I got it really cheap. So when I seen it in the Balgam bin, I was like, you know what, I'm going to pick it up and play it, because again, I knew from playing it before I had managed to get into it to some degree, and I was like, you know what, it's worthwhile giving a go. But in saying that, the game is relatively short in terms of its story. Like, there's only a handful of levels in the game, and I could always get to the last area or the last level of the game, but there was always that one part in the game where you had to jump across like a cliff, and there was all like these moving platforms, because that was the thing. The game, while it did have like beat 'em up and combat style elements, in certain instances you had to use platforming elements, which that was definitely its Achilles heel. It just wasn't as well executed. It was very clunky, it was very sluggish, and that part, no matter how many times I've played the game, even up until this day, I've still never managed to get past that. But I'm going to change that. I'm going to make sure that I play that. And now obviously we can play it through emulation. We can use quick saves or save states to, again, save it at different points. So I'm going to make it my goal to finally get further in this game and finally finish it, because that's the one part of the game, especially in the last level with those moving platforms, because the way the camera angles are situated, because it's so far away, you think you're jumping on a moving platform to think that you're going to get to it, but you don't. You always fall through and you'll end up losing all your lives, and that was always so frustrating. You get so far in the game and then you would literally lose it all just on that one part. And I think only ever once that I ever get past it, when I really think about it. But what happened was then I had literally no health left, so I died on the first enemy that came my way the second I got onto the next scene. So I just never really got that opportunity, because I literally would be gone and lose all my lives before that point. I would always do so well leading up to that, but then I'd lose all my lives in that one bit. So that was easily the most frustrating part of the game for me, and I'm sure it probably is for many, but then I'm sure the game just was frustrating in general for a lot of people. But I would always persist with it. But it was the one game that, I'll be honest, did defeat me back then. I couldn't finish it no matter what I did. That one part, and it was just ridiculous. It was just far too difficult. But alas, I'm willing to give it a go again and torture myself, so here goes nothing, as they say. But regardless of what I think about the game, yes, it is very hit and miss. It's definitely not the best of these style of games, even I'll admit that. But there's enough unique quirks about it that I personally like, but then it just has elements in it that reminds me of other games that I like of that era. I like the experimental nature of it, while it's not executed great at all, but it does have some unique quirks and elements. Plus I like the background scenery in the levels as well. That for me is the key feature, because it definitely provides that ambience and atmosphere that I like in those type of games. But then that's just my personal opinion of it. So, but it is what it is, you know, it's not for everybody. But regardless, I would love to hear your thoughts of Men in Black, the game for the PlayStation, and if so, what did you think of this game overall? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other types of games similar to this, or even likes of any type of games that use pre-rendered backgrounds that would be similar to old school Resident Evil or survival horror style games, then make sure to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell to be updated of future videos. And if you would like to see videos that I've already covered on the channel regarding similar games that are like this, then you can check out the playlist on screen to see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.